Well, it really was kind of a tale of two halves in a lot of ways, Coach Jake. Congrats on the win, but you look up and 54-10. What was said at the break and what adjustments were made to find that rhythm offensively?
Well, what we talked about at halftime was the defense had to just continue to do what they were doing, which we thought they were playing very, very well. And the offense just needed to finish off some drives, and the scoreboard would look a lot different. We felt like we dominated on defense really in that first half. And then, on offense, they're very good on defense. And it was hard early on. And then we stuck with it and then got the rhythm a little bit there in the third and beginning of the fourth.
All right, so what you would expect him to say after a game like that. And as you know, I don't just sit there and recap the game, but I do have a lot of thoughts. Okay, so the first thing that he said is we got to finish off drives. Yes, and the score would have looked wildly different, in particular with the way that the Ohio State defense was giving their offense a short field really throughout that first half. If Ohio State's offense is even remotely good in the first half, they've got a giant lead in that game. Giant lead. And so the fact that Iowa's defense, which came in as one of the best defenses in college football, and by the way, I still think that they're one of the best defenses in college football. The fact that they held them to those field goals is the reason that we didn't have that runaway from Ohio State. Now, it would come later, but I want to talk first about style, okay? And not necessarily style points from an Ohio State perspective, but style of game. All right, and blueprint. Because here's what you have to understand. This Iowa team, and more importantly, program, because it's not just this year, they've been doing this for years and years and years at Iowa. Their blueprint is to minimize the number of possessions you get as an opponent, to win the field position battle, to create good field position for their offense, in particular short fields, and try to steal some points here or there, and then get you into a situation where it's uncomfortable late. And then they're like, this is what we want. Hopefully we can win the line of scrimmage. And in particular late, our will break your will, and we'll win the game. And we'll make one more play than you do. And we've seen that work for a lot of years for Kirk Ferentz. And it's not working this year, and we understand that, right? They play in small margins, and they play on the fine line. But let's go back to the blueprint like I was talking about. For them to be effective, they have to reduce the number of overall possessions that you get as an opponent. And through the first few, really 10 possessions, 8 possessions of this game on Saturday, they were doing exactly what Iowa needed to do to stay in a game and produce a one-possession game late in the fourth quarter. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Through the first 8 possessions in that ball game that Ohio State had, they had scored 1 touchdown and kicked 4 field goals. That's 19 points. Okay, now they had also scored a defensive touchdown. Let's just remove that, right? And just talk about the style. Like, how is the blueprint supposed to work for Iowa? Well, that's how it's supposed to work. You're forcing them to kick field goals. You give up maybe 1 touchdown. Through 8 possessions, it's 19 offensive points. Maybe you steal a half field here or there. Maybe you can get into the end zone yourself. Maybe you can get into the end zone on the offense. Let's say it's 19-14 through 8 possessions. Guess where it should be in the game on the scoreboard through 8 possessions? If they're doing their job, if their offensive line can play a requisite level, if they can sustain drives, what should happen, the design for Iowa is that at that point through 8 possessions, it's about 8-minute mark of the fourth quarter. Maybe less than that, 7-minute, 6-minute mark of the fourth quarter. So at that time, then Ohio State's at home. It's 19-14. And all of a sudden, you're in this dogfight, right? You feel like you've been taken into deep water by Iowa. That's how they're built. That's how their defense played in the first 8 possessions. Here's the problem. Through those 8 possessions offensively for Ohio State, guess how much time had come off the clock? It was still 11:44 left in the third quarter. At that point, it's unsustainable. That defense cannot hold up anymore. You can't give Ohio State that many bites at the apple before the avalanche of points is going to eventually come to you. And that's exactly what happened. In the subsequent 4 possessions, Ohio State scored 4 offensive touchdowns, blew the game wide open. And when you couple that with the fact that they did have a defensive score earlier, what do you get? You get 54 points. So the fact that the blueprint for Iowa was working, except for their offense could not sustain. So what does that lead us to? Okay, so what are you explaining here, Joel? Well, here's what I'm explaining. You can sit there, and this game was really more about what was happening when Iowa had the ball and when Ohio State was on defense. And why was that so important? Well, two things can be true at the same time in this game. Iowa can be awful on offense, and a really good defense for Ohio State can be doing exactly what they should do to a bad offense, right? Iowa's offense was awful. I'm not defending it. You're not defending it. That was bad. That was awful. So what should a good defense, albeit a really good defense, do to an offense like that? Thoroughly dominate them. Well, Joel, when they see an offense like that, they definitely shouldn't have 10 or more first downs. Iowa didn't. Probably shouldn't have 200 total yards. Iowa didn't. Probably should be like less than 15% on third down conversions. Iowa was less than 15%. What were the actual numbers? Well, 8 first downs, 158 total yards, and 1 of 13 on third down. So what I'm trying to say is Ohio State did exactly what they should do to that offensive team. And that was part of the reason why it was still at the 11:44 mark in the third quarter. You see, Ohio State kept gaining possessions for their offense. That's what makes Ohio State much better this year than they were a year ago. Okay, we've seen times throughout history in college football where really good offenses that you would categorize at the top of college football, can get stymied through 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 possessions. So what's the difference? Well, those teams can get beat if their defense does not keep providing them opportunities. And that's exactly what Ohio State did. They scored defensively. They kept gaining turnovers. They kept applying the pressure. They kept dominating the opponent. So that's good news for the Ohio State Buckeyes. That's good news for the Ohio State Buckeyes. And when you actually look at it in comparison to the only team that you can compare Ohio State to this year, because they're going to have to play them late in November, they actually dominated that offense to a much better degree than Michigan dominated the Iowa offense just a few weeks ago, albeit that one was at home for Iowa and this one was on the road. But the numbers are actually pretty stark. When you look at what Iowa did offensively against Michigan, because remember, these are the two freight trains that are pointing at each other. So can we really evaluate Ohio State without bringing up Michigan? Can we really evaluate Michigan without bringing up Ohio State? I don't think you can, because those two teams have to go through one another to get even to the Big Ten championship game. Okay, so these freight trains are pointed at each other, which means all we can do is start comparing where are they against one another with common opponents, with the way that they played on any given week. And now we've got this common opponent, and you're going to see Iowa's offense against Ohio State had 8 first downs, 158 total yards, and they were 1 of 13 on third downs. Michigan held Iowa to 16 first downs, 281 total yards, and 4 of 11 on third down. So the numbers weren't as good. The numbers weren't as good, and I, for one, and not many people out there were sitting there after Michigan beat Iowa pretty thoroughly on the road. None of us were sitting there like, yeah, but, they still ain't played nobody. For whatever reason, the standard that everyone holds Ohio State to is extraordinary. And what you'll see here in a moment is like, this team is actually really scary. And let me get to that in a moment. Let me talk first about this defense, because I'm talking a lot about the defense. The defense did what we haven't seen before under Ryan Day, which is they were dominating a game and just providing this really good offense more bites at the apple. Okay, so this defense is now one of the best statistical defenses in all of college football, okay? You look at the fact that they are a top 10 pressure defense. They also started getting to the quarterback, 5 sacks. You look at this defense and what they are from, total defense, scoring defense, yards per play defense, rush defense, pass defense, all of it's top 10. We're getting to the point now, they're a top 5 scoring 5th in the country in scoring defense, 2nd in the entire country in total defense. I think that would really surprise people. Ohio State is number 2 in the country in total defense right now. That's a scary proposition because we know how good their offense is, in particular when you keep giving them opportunities like a defense like they have can do. And Iowa learned that on Saturday. So how is this defense built? How have they fixed it? Well, let's go into that really quickly. Okay, so Jim Knowles, the defensive coordinator for Ohio State, he comes in from Oklahoma State. Okay, and he built a really good defense at Duke. He then built a really good defense at Oklahoma State. Now, he's starting to, what I believe, build a really good defense and maybe even quicker than he did at the previous locations, but he's building a really good defense at Ohio State. So how does he do it? So I asked him about this. I thought it was a really fascinating and fun conversation to have. As you know, I nerd out. I love talking with these guys about schematics, their philosophy. And for Jim, I wanted to ask him really about the origins of this philosophy. Some of my favorite conversations throughout doing this job is like, for instance, sitting with Mike Leach, asking him how he built the air raid. When he and Hal Mummy built the air raid, how was it born, right? Same with like Lincoln Riley. Your philosophy of the run mixed with the air raid pass, how was that born? And with Jim Knowles, I finally was able to have that conversation about this defense and this defensive philosophy, which is fairly unique. The structure is not super unique, but the philosophy of how he uses this structure is fairly unique. Okay, and so let me take you into what he and I talked about. Number one, that he sat there with David Cutcliffe at Duke, and he said, with the way modern offense is going, I've got to build a defense that can communicate really quickly with quick calls. But it's not just about having calls that are really quick, maybe even one word. It's about those calls allowing us to be really multiple in how we attack the offense. So remember, like, most teams offensively use a quicker tempo because they feel like it's going to give them an advantage because they feel like they're going to get more vanilla looks on the other side because it's just harder to make defensive calls. So he wanted to build a system and a communication pattern that would allow him to be multiple, blitz, change the front, change the coverage, and communicate it in a really quick manner. I thought that was, really cool. And then also it's like, okay, well, that's just language, right? So let's talk more about structure. And so he said, well, I'm getting to that because there was only 2 bullet points. One was quickly communicate, and the second was disguise. I wanted to build a structure and a defense that in every single call and at every single moment, we were disguising for 2 people, the offensive coordinator on the other side, play caller, and the quarterback. I thought that was interesting. And so he went into how he loves the 4-2-5 because you've got 3 safeties and you can disguise the coverage and you can really mix and match who's dropping, when they're dropping, who's blitzing, when they're blitzing, and you can change front structure, so on and so forth. So quickly call a defense, be multiple in the way that you attack the offense, and then have the ability to disguise. And the purpose in disguising is to confuse the play caller pre-snap, because all these offenses love to look over to the sideline. Also confuse the quarterback, both pre-snap and post-snap. And why? What are you trying to achieve? You're trying to force the coordinator to stick with a play call, and then for the quarterback to pat the ball and wait for a moment in the pocket. And what does that moment achieve? Pressure. So the disguise is all about presenting pressure on the quarterback. So you're trying to confuse him, make him go to a second look, pat the ball, get uncomfortable for a moment mentally, and then you're going to make him uncomfortable physically with your ability to get to the passer. And they did that, and they do that. This is a top 10 pressure rate team from a defensive standpoint. They got 5 sacks. This is a team that hadn't gotten to the quarterback yet, but you knew it was coming. Why did you know it was coming? Because Jim Knowles at Oklahoma State, with, I would say, actually lesser players, and that's not a knock, it just is what it is when you look at the recruiting statistics, they led the country in sacks last year with 4 per game. There was only one team that had more total sacks than Oklahoma State, and that was Alabama with 1 more game that they played. in the 15 rather than the 14 Oklahoma State played. So in terms of a per game, Oklahoma State was the best quarterback rush team in the country. Why? Disguise. Forcing the quarterback to just hold the ball a beat longer than he wants to. And we saw that show up against Iowa. I believe those numbers will continue. I believe that their pressure rate will continue. I believe their ability to get to the quarterback will continue. We may see it even this week against Penn State. So that's how they're built. And I think that's why they've got some staying power. And then they were also able to create the turnovers. So this defense, let's recap, dominated a team that they should dominate. And why is that important? Well, this is why it's important. Because after all that's being said, okay, and you take a look at that game, here's kind of a bottom line description of Ohio State's win over Iowa. I don't think anybody would say or argue, and I certainly wouldn't, would argue that Ohio State played well. I mean, they had to settle for 4 field goals on short fields in the first half. This is the best offense in the country, right? I mean, like, they didn't play well, right? They played okay. They got it going late, right? They played good. And blew the doors off of Iowa. Wasn't even close. Scored more points on the scoreboard than anybody's ever scored against a Kirk Ferentz team. There's only been 3 other teams get into the 40s since 2015. Stanford in the Rose Bowl with Christian McCaffrey, an Iowa State team that, by the way, Iowa still won that game early in the season, 44-41, and Michigan in the Big Ten championship game last year. So, like, since 2015, teams don't even score in the 40s. Ohio State didn't even play well and dropped a 54 on that team. That's scary. 54-10, spreads 30, they covered, dropped 54, worst loss in the Ferentz era, and you're like, nah, they played okay. I mean, do you see, like, now, in hindsight, after you peel back the layers of this onion, you sit there and you're like, well, this is scary. This is scary how good Ohio State could be, because everyone always wants to look to the offense, and that's how we're going to define a team as playing well or not playing well. But the bottom line is that this defense thoroughly dominated a team that they should thoroughly dominate. They basically allowed 3 points, because remember, the score for Iowa as far as the touchdown goes was the defensive score. They allowed 3 points, and it was a long field goal. So how good can Ohio State be? Well, they didn't even play well and absolutely roasted Iowa 54-10. So I think that they're really good. And once I finally got to that point and I thought more about the game and I thought about all of these things that I've been talking about right now, that's why it was so easy to still put them number 1. Because they're still so much more complete than anybody else in the country. Nobody else can couple that offensive firepower with that amount of defensive dominance. You can't, right? So, like, the dominant defense for Alabama, yeah, they were great against Mississippi State, only scored 30 points. Tennessee doesn't have a defense like Ohio State's, not even close, quite frankly. Look at the passing yards they just gave up this weekend and last weekend. I told you again and again, Florida and Alabama had more first downs than Tennessee, more total yards than Tennessee, even though Tennessee won those games. A bad Pittsburgh team, maybe that's harsh, but remember, they were down to a backup quarterback. He was hobbling around, took them to overtime. So why is Ohio State still number 1? That's why, because they don't even have to play well, and they beat Kirk Ferentz in Iowa 54-10. It's wild. And once I finally, I started writing all this down late last night on the plane ride. I watched the game back today on film, preparing for the game against Ohio State and Penn State this week. And it just hits me. I'm like, oh my gosh, it was 54-10. It's a scary proposition.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoy that clip, make sure you click subscribe somewhere down here. From game highlights to exclusive interviews and rankings, we've got everything you need as a college football fan right here, College Football on Fox.